when the world falls silent and the stars begin to whisper, I collect the dreams left behind. Welcome to Moonlight Tales, where every story is a doorway and every night a journey. My name is Eldrick, and tonight I'll be your guide. Somewhere between the hush of twilight and the first breath of sleep lies a world few remember, but some still carry in their hearts. Tonight, let me take you there. A quiet village, a forgotten dream, and a child who was never meant to rule, only to remember. So make yourself comfortable. Let the world slow down. And if this story brings you peace, consider staying. There's always room for one more dreamer. Now, ... Close your eyes. The dragon is waiting. There was a village that never showed up on maps, hidden beyond the folds of mist-covered hills and quiet glens where lavender bloomed year-round. The people called it Roseville. And though no signpost ever led there, anyone who stumbled upon it, whether by wandering path or a strange dream, felt as though they had arrived somewhere familiar, somewhere meant just for them. At the far end of the village, where the cobblestone paths turned to moss and the air tasted faintly of honey and pine, there stood a small cottage with a blue-painted door and wind chimes made of teacups. This was where Elenara lived, a quiet girl with moonlight in her eyes and hair like the wind-stirred pages of an old storybook. She was 9 years old, and though her voice was soft and her feet even softer, her thoughts wandered farther than anyone could guess. Elenara lived with her grandmother, Afa, a gentle woman whose voice carried the warmth of steeped herbs and who wore long skirts with patchwork moons sewn into the hem. Marfa never rushed, not even when the bread was burning, and she spoke to bees as if they were dear old friends who had simply taken the shape of insects for convenience. Their days unfolded slowly, like petals reluctant to bloom too early. Mornings began with the chirp of sleepy birds and the distant sound of the creek behind the cottage. Elenara would help Marfa gather herbs from the garden: sage, lemon balm, starflower, brushing dew from the leaves with her fingertips. She liked the feel of morning sun on her hands and the way the wind sometimes whispered her name, even when no one else was around. Afternoons were quiet. She would sit under the twisted willow tree near the brook, her bare feet tickled by the grass, a book in her lap that she mostly pretended to read. She often found herself staring into the ripples of the water instead, wondering why her heart sometimes felt like it was waiting for something it could not name. A longing, not sad, but old and patient, lived quietly inside her, as though a part of her remembered something forgotten by everyone else. At twilight, the village chimneys breathed curls of smoke into the sky, and the scent of cinnamon and earth hung in the air. Inside the cottage, lamplight glowed golden, stretching long shadows across shelves filled with dried herbs, bundles of lavender, and tiny glass bottles with handwritten labels: Whisperleaf, Foxdream, Star Shadow. That was when Marfa would begin her stories. She never told them from a book. Her tales came from memory, or from some place even deeper. The hush between thunder and rain, the breath between dreams. Elenara would listen, curled up in a thick woolen blanket, a cup of warm milk with honey in her hands, the weight of the day lifting slowly from her small shoulders. But even in the warmth of that light, even wrapped in story and silence, Elenara sometimes felt a pull, gentle like a tide toward something more. She never spoke of it. She barely understood it. But there were moments when she'd look out the window at the night sky and feel as though someone, somewhere, was watching her, waiting for her, not with urgency, but with hope, as though she were part of a promise the world had not yet remembered. At night, she climbed the creaky steps to her attic room, where a brass bed waited beside a round window that looked out over the hills. Her blanket was thick and hand-stitched, the dark blue of twilight, embroidered with the tiny silver stars. A small candle burned on her bedside table, its flame steady and calm. Above her bed, painted on the ceiling by her own hand, was a dragon, curled in sleep, its wings folded like a cloak, eyes closed in ancient slumber. She didn't know why she'd drawn it. She'd done so one day, without thinking. One quiet afternoon, when the wind had pressed against the window and the smell of lavender and rain had filled the room. The image had poured from her like breath, and when it was finished, she'd felt a strange stillness in her chest. Not fear, not joy, stillness, like the pause before music begins. Every night, before drifting off, Elenara would look up at that painted dragon and whisper, "Good night, whoever you are. I think you're waiting too." Then she would close her eyes and let herself fall, not into sleep exactly, but into something softer, into dreams that smelled of starlight and feathers, where forests hummed with lullabies and lakes reflected skies that weren't always blue. And in those dreams, though she never remembered clearly, there was always a mountain in the distance, always a silhouette too large to be real, always a golden shimmer between the clouds. The people of Roseville said she had an old soul, that she carried something in her that was older than the hills, quieter than the stars. But Elenara didn't know about souls or stories. She only knew that something inside her stirred when the wind sighed low, when the fire popped softly in the hearth, when her grandmother's voice wove tales of things lost and found again, and that, somehow, without understanding why, she longed to be found. It happened on a night that seemed no different from any other. The moon hung low, round and golden, casting soft light through the attic window like a quiet guardian. The air was cool, but not cold, and the crickets outside sang their slow evening lullaby. Elenara had just tucked herself beneath her starlit quilt, her fingers tracing the embroidered constellations out of habit. She had not spoken much that day, only a few words to Marfa and a brief thank you to the creek when it offered her a smooth, round stone. Some days were like that, not lonely, just still. She yawned, closed her eyes, and let the rhythm of the house, the creaks, the sighs, the occasional distant hoot of an owl lull her into sleep. But the moment her breath began to deepen, something changed. It wasn't a noise that woke her, not exactly. It was more like a silence that grew too loud, as though the world had stopped exhaling for just a moment too long. Then came the voice. It did not speak in words at first. Spoke in feeling, in weight, in warmth, in the way sunlight feels when it first touches your face in the morning. Elenara's dreaming self stood in a great field of bluegrass, the sky overhead, dark but sparkling with stars that pulsed like heartbeats. Wind tugged gently at her nightdress, but there was no fear in her, only wonder. And then the voice came again, this time with a name, Elenara. It was vast and slow and ancient, a voice that had spoken to mountains, a voice that echoed across time like a lullaby hummed by the earth itself. She turned toward the sound, heart thudding softly, and saw a shape curled atop a distant hill. It was too large to be a creature at first glance. It seemed part of the land, but the closer she looked, the more she could see its scales glimmering like armor made of starlight and gold. Massive wings lay folded against its sides, and smoke curled gently from its nostrils. Even in sleep, a dragon, not fierce, not fire and claw, but dreaming, resting, and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. "You are the last," the voice whispered, though the dragon's mouth never moved. "You are the one who remembers." Elenara wanted to ask what that meant. The last of what? What was she remembering? She found she could not speak. The dream self only nodded slowly, her hand over her heart, where something warm now glowed, faintly beneath her skin. "You are queen," the voice said at last, not like a command, but like a truth finally spoken aloud. "Even if no one bows, even if no throne stands." And then everything faded. the dragon, the hill, paid, the stars, all swirling gently into a mist of soft gold and silence. She awoke with a start. The candle beside her bed had burned low, but was still alight, flickering calmly as though it, too, had been listening. Her chest still felt warm, though the feeling was already beginning to fade. Like the taste of honey once swallowed, Elenara sat up slowly, heart thudding, not with fear, but with awe. She blinked, then glanced down and gasped there, just beside her pillow, where no one had placed anything the night before, was a single scale. It shimmered gold and silver, faintly iridescent, no larger than her palm, but heavy with something unspoken. When she picked it up, it felt cool and smooth, but vibrated faintly in her hand, like it remembered where it had come from. It's like it knew her. She clutched it tightly to her chest and looked out the round attic window. The sky was pale with the approach of dawn, and birds were just beginning to stir in the trees. She didn't tell Marfa, not yet. Some part of her knew this wasn't a story ready for words. Not until she understood it herself. Not until the dream returned, or the dragon woke. But from that morning on, something in Elenara had changed. Not in a loud, sudden way. Not like stories where heroes run off with swords. This was gentler, a quiet shifting of gravity. A knowing, even if she didn't yet know what she knew. She began to carry the scale with her, tucked into the small pocket of her coat or beneath the pillow where she slept. And everywhere she went, the world seemed to respond differently. The birds would pause longer before flying off. The creek seemed to hum in a lower, softer tone when she passed. The wind knew her name. Even the willow tree, old and wise and slow to change, dropped one of its silver leaves directly into her lap as she read beneath it that afternoon. A gift, perhaps, or a sign, or both. And though she still helped Marfa with the herbs and listened to her stories and gathered stones from the brook, Elenara began to notice traces of something hidden just behind the world she knew. A moth with eyes on its wings. A root shaped like a crown. A faint melody that hummed only when she stood still with her eyes closed. It was as though the veil between waking and dreaming had grown thin, and she had stepped quietly into the space between. The days that followed moved like pages turning in an old, delicate book. Not fast, not slow, but with purpose. Something within Elenara had shifted. And though the village around her remained the same, the thatched roofs, the cobblestone paths, the lazy breeze that danced through drying linens, she walked through it all as though seeing it for the very first time. Her steps were quieter now, not out of fear, but out of reverence, as though the world itself had become a sacred place, filled with whispers she was only just beginning to hear. The golden scale never left her side. During the day, she kept it tucked inside the lining of her coat. At night, it lay beneath her pillow, pulsing with a faint warmth that soothed her into sleep. It had become more than a gift. It was a key, though she didn't yet know to what. One morning, as mist still clung to the fields and the sky was brushed with the pale blush of dawn, Elenara wandered beyond the garden gate. Marfa, who usually reminded her to stay near the creek, said nothing. She only offered her a warm piece of honeyed bread and kissed the top of her head with a whispered, "Follow the quiet." So Elenara did. She followed the sound of her own breath, the hush of grass beneath her feet, the rustle of leaves speaking softly among themselves, past the edge of the willow grove, where the trees grew taller and the light fell in slanted beams through the canopy. She saw something she had never noticed before, a circle of mushrooms, perfectly round, sitting like pale moons nestled in the moss dot in the very center of the ring, glowing faintly like breath in cold air, hovered a single blue butterfly, its wings marked with tiny flecks of gold, like it had been dipped in starlight. It hovered, waited, then flitted toward the trees. Elenara didn't think. She simply followed. The forest welcomed her, not with grand spectacle, but with subtle wonders. A brook that sang without water. Trees whose bark bore old runes, visible only when the sun passed through them just right. She passed under an arch of tangled vines and felt the air shift, not cooler, not warmer, just deeper. She knew, somehow, that this part of the forest wasn't on any map. It was part of the old world, the dream world, and it had opened just for her. The butterfly led her to a glade she'd never seen, a circle of stones, half sunken in moss, surrounding a pool so still it reflected the sky with uncanny clarity. No frogs croaked here, no birds called. It was the kind of silence that listened. At the edge of the pool stood a figure, small, like her, but not entirely human. He wore a cloak made of stitched feathers, and his hair shimmered like dew. When he turned to her, his eyes were wide and silver, like moonlit glass. "You heard the voice," he said, without introduction. Elenara blinked. "Yes," she whispered, "but I don't understand it." "You don't need to. Not yet." He knelt by the water and touched its surface with 2 fingers. "You saw him sleeping? The dragon?" He nodded. "He's been dreaming a long time. Longer than you've been alive. Longer than this forest." But something woke him, not all the way, just a flicker. "That was you." Elenara stepped closer to the water, looking at her own reflection beside his. The golden scale in her pocket warmed, as though humming in agreement. "Why me?" "Because you remember," the boy said simply. "Not with your mind, with your heart." He turned to face her fully then and reached into the pouch at his side, withdrawing a small stone shaped like a curled leaf. "This will help you see what's hidden," he said, placing it gently in her palm, "but only when you stop trying to see." Before she could ask another question, Toa Butterfly rose again and darted into the trees, and the boy followed without a sound, his feathered cloak trailing behind him like mist. Elenara stood in the glade for a long while. The stone in her hand felt cool, smooth, and silent, but she knew it was watching, waiting. That evening, when she returned home, the world felt softer somehow, as though her journey had not taken her far, but had instead peeled back a layer of the world she thought she knew. Marfa didn't ask where she had been. She only poured warm tea and lit the lamp with a smile that told Elenara she already knew. Later that night, when Elenara laid her head on the pillow, her dreams came faster than usual, thick with golden fog and wing beats in the distance. She stood once more at the edge of the field, but this time she wasn't alone. Tiny lights floated in the air around her, soft orbs of blue and white and gold. Fireflies, perhaps, or souls, or thoughts left behind in dreams. They circled her, gently humming low, and she understood, somehow, that they were part of the path. They had once belonged to others like her, dreamers, rememberers, and I. In the distance, on the hill, the dragon still slept, but now one of his eyes was half open, glowing faintly, like a coal beneath ash. He was waiting, and she was on her way. The wind shifted the next day, not with thunder or rain, but with a scent. Something sweet and ancient rode the breeze, curling through the herb garden and slipping beneath doors and windowsills. It smelled faintly of jasmine and parchment, as though the air had passed through a library. No, one had walked in for centuries. Elenara woke with the sense that something was waiting for her. Not out in the forest this time, but within the walls of her own home. She followed the feeling down the creaking stairs, barefoot and quiet, her fingers grazing the rail as if steadying herself for something she didn't yet understand. Marfa was already awake, standing at the kitchen table with a bundle of dried herbs in one hand and a letter in the other. Not a new letter. Elenara knew the paper's age just by the way the corners curled. Kayla, Its edges were browned with time, and the ribbon that had once sealed it had long since faded to a faint lilac gray. Marfa did not look up right away. She simply stared at the letter, as if reading it for the 100th time. "Is that new?" Elenara asked softly. Marfa shook her head. "It's been waiting for the right day to be read aloud." She patted the chair beside her, and Elenara sat, the golden scale tucked safely in the pocket of her robe. The scent of rosemary and lemon balm drifted between them. Marfa unfolded the letter with care. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from memory. "It's from my grandmother," she began. "Great-great-grandmother, Leora. She was the last dream warden." Elenara tilted her head. "What's a dream warden?" Marfa smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds both pride and sadness. "Once, long ago, before the maps forgot, there were people born with hearts tied to both worlds, the waking and the dreaming. They were called dream wardens, keepers of the unseen. They walked the edges of sleep, spoke to stars, and kept a balance between silence and storm." Elenara's breath caught in her throat. The word balance rang inside her, like a bell. Leora wrote this when she knew her time was ending. She said the dragon would sleep until the one who could awaken him was born again, not as a warrior, not as a queen in towers, but as a child who listened. She began to read, her voice like wind through the trees. "To the one who dreams without fear. If this letter finds you, it means the time is near. The dragon sleeps beneath the mountain of clouds, where the breath of the world hides in mist and music. You will not find him with swords. You will not wake him with fire. You must listen. You must remember what the stones have forgotten. And when the stars point the way, you must follow with kindness, not command. You are not chosen by crown, but by courage. The soft kind, the quiet kind, the kind that kneels beside sorrow and does not turn away." Marfa paused then, eyes damp. Leora knew that someday someone would be born with the old knowing inside them again. And Elenara, too. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the little owl-shaped clock above the window. "But I'm not brave," Elenara said at last, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to keep balance or walk between worlds." "Do," Marfa said gently, brushing a curl from Elenara's forehead. "Because you already are. You've been listening your whole life to the wind, the trees, the hush in between things. That's what a dream warden does." Elenara looked down at her hands. One held the letter. The other, without her realizing, had curled protectively over the golden scale. "There's more," Marfa added. "Something Leora left behind. Something she hid where no one would think to look. Not in a vault or tower, but in story." She reached for a book on the shelf. It looked like a simple collection of bedtime tales, the kind with soft illustrations and worn pages from years of being read aloud. Elenara knew it well. Tea had been hers since she could remember. But now, with new eyes, she watched as Marfa opened the book to the final page, a blank one, or so it had seemed, under the soft light of the morning. Faint words began to shimmer across the page, written in the same curling hand as the letter. "Beneath the willow's third root lies the dreamer's circle. Speak the name of the dragon, not with voice, but with breath. There, the path will show itself." Elenara's heart thudded once, then twice, as if something inside her had recognized the truth before her mind could catch up. The third root, the willow. She knew exactly which one. That afternoon, when the sky was painted with 1,000 soft shades of gold and rose, Elenara returned to the willow tree beside the creek, the one she'd sat under all her life. Never knowing it hid a secret older than stories, she knelt by the roots, her fingers brushing aside leaves and soil until she found it. The third root, curved like a crescent moon, thick with moss and age. She closed her eyes. She didn't speak. She simply breathed, slow, deep, and steady. and the earth responded. A circle of stones appeared beneath the grass, humming softly. It's barely visible unless one knew how to look sideways through the veil of the world. At its center, carved into the earth, was the symbol of a curled dragon, the same she'd painted on her ceiling years ago. Without knowing why, Elenara stepped into the circle, and for the first time, she felt it, the old magic. It wasn't loud or showy. It didn't roar or burn. It simply was, as natural as air, steady as sleep, and for the first time in her young life, she did not feel small. She felt part of something vast and beautiful, something awakening. The days grew quieter after that, not because the village changed or the wind stopped humming through the leaves, but because something within Elenara was changing, something she couldn't name, only feel. She no longer wandered aimlessly. Every path she took now felt chosen, even if she didn't yet know by whom. The world was softer, but also heavier, as if the silence between things held more meaning than ever before. She walked with care, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what she might step into, and slowly, gently, the questions began to press closer, not the kind that asked about dragons or secrets, the kind that whispered in the hours before dawn, when dreams had not yet lifted and the fire in the hearth burned low. Why me? She didn't say it aloud, not to Marfa, not even to the wind, but it was there, resting in her chest like a feather with the weight of stone. Because while the signs had led her and the stories had named her, Elenara couldn't help but feel unsure. She was no queen. She didn't know how to wield power, or protect anyone, or stand tall like the heroines in Marfa's stories. She wasn't fearless. She cried when bees died, and sometimes her hands trembled when she spoke in front of others. Her voice was quiet, her heart too soft. How could someone like her awaken a dragon who had slumbered through centuries? It was this thought that led her, one cloudy evening, into the old path behind the creek, the one where the trees grew taller and the sky disappeared above their thick canopy. She walked without knowing where she was going, her feet crunching gently on pine needles, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The golden scale was warm in her pocket, as always, though tonight it felt heavier, as if it too carried questions. Eventually, she reached a clearing she'd never seen before. It wasn't grand, no magical light, no ancient stones, just a quiet, open space beneath a tree that looked as if it had been growing since time began. Its trunk was wide and knotted, its roots spread across the ground like the hands of a giant, and a ring of mushrooms circled it, glowing faintly in the dim light. Elenara sat at the base of the tree, legs crossed, fingers twisting a strayed thread from her sleeve. She didn't speak. She just breathed, and slowly, without effort, the memories came, not of dragons or dreams, but of smaller things, of her mother's lullaby, long forgotten, of the time she found a wounded bird and stayed by its side all night, whispering stories. To it, in the dark dot of the morning, Marfa cried quietly while reading an old letter, and Elenara brought her a single sprig of mint, not because she knew what to say, but because she knew silence could also be kindness. Moments like those returned to her now, stringing together like pearls, forming something greater than she'd ever seen. Not power, not greatness, but gentleness, attention, love so quiet the world sometimes missed it. The dragon had not called for a warrior. He had called for someone who remembered how to listen. Elenara leaned, her head back against the tree trunk. Above her, the branches barely swayed, though no wind stirred. The silence in the clearing was complete, not empty, but full, live with memory. She felt it pressed gently around her, not to crush her, but to remind her she was never alone. Not in her fear, not in her wondering, not even in her quiet. From her pocket, she pulled the golden scale for the first time. She held it, not like a clue or a burden or a puzzle. She held it like a part of herself, and as she did, a soft warmth spread through her fingers, her arms, her chest. Not heat, but comfort. The same warmth she'd felt as a child, tucked beside Marfa by the fire. Listening to tales of things forgotten and forgiven, the scale pulsed once, faintly. Then again, and with it, so did something within her. A rhythm, a beat, not of her heart, but of something older. A memory, a presence, a name. She didn't say it aloud. She didn't need to. She only breathed it, and in that breath, the world shifted. A faint glow rose from the earth beneath the roots, curling upward like mist. Not bright, not loud, just a gentle shimmer, like the sky smiling in its sleep. Elenara didn't cry, but her eyes filled, because for the first time, she understood. The journey wasn't about becoming more than she was. It was about remembering who she'd always been. She sat in the clearing until the first light of dawn touched the edges of the sky, painting everything in blue and gold. When she finally stood, she was still Elenara, but now she walked with the stillness of someone who no longer needed to ask why, only where. The morning after her silent crossing, the air felt clearer, lighter. Elenara awoke before the sun, not startled, not restless, simply ready. There was no voice that called her this time, no symbol glowing beneath the bed, no butterfly at the windowsill, just a quiet certainty humming in her bones. The dream hadn't come in the night, and yet it was as though she had never left it. She rose, dressed in her soft wool coat and long scarf, and tucked the golden scale into a pouch tied gently to her side. She didn't wake Marfa. Somehow, she knew her grandmother would understand. There are journeys we must begin alone, even when we are loved. Outside, the village still slept, roofs dusted with dew, chimneys waiting for fire. Elenara stepped lightly across the stones, passing the willow, the herb garden, the little bridge over the creek, places she had known her whole life. But they no longer felt like destinations. They were echoes, steps already taken. She entered the forest, not with the nervousness of before, but with calm. The path had changed, or perhaps she had, and though the trees stood as tall as ever, the space between them no longer whispered caution. It sang a song without melody, familiar and deep. The mist grew thicker as she climbed the slope. She'd never noticed until now a hill that did not exist on any village trail. With each step, the fog thinned, not from wind, but from her presence. If it were opening for her, welcoming her deeper into what had always waited at the top of the hill. The world widened. Before her stretched a vast, floating valley. The sky no longer hung above her. It surrounded everything, soft and endless, tinged with lavender and gold. There were no trees here, no houses, just wild flowers that swayed without wind and clouds, drifting low across the earth like veils of breath. And in the center of it all, resting atop a stone platform shaped like a spiral shell, lay the dragon. He was enormous, his body curled, gently like a sleeping cat, wings folded like silk. His scales shimmered in shifting hues of gold and ivory, and each breath he took seemed to move the very air around her. But there was no fear, no sense of danger, only only peace. Elenara walked slowly, reverently, her boots pressing softly into the grass that glowed faintly beneath her. Her heart beat not with panic, but with purpose, steady and sure, as if guided by the earth itself. The dragon did not stir. His eyes remained closed, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm older than rain. Elenara stepped to the edge of the stone platform and sat, cross-legged, her hands in her lap. She didn't reach out. She didn't speak. She simply waited. Time passed in the way it only can in dreams, not fast, not slow, just full. And then, without a sound, one of the dragon's eyes opened. It was vast and golden, deep as a well of stars. It did not blink. It did not glow. It simply looked at her, and in that gaze, she felt everything. She saw 1,000 nights where he had kept watch over sleeping kingdoms. 1,000 storms he had weathered in silence. 1,000 names whispered to him in dream, waiting for the right one to answer. She saw herself, not older, not different, but true. The dragon did not speak with words. He had never needed them. But in the space between his breath and hers, Elenara understood. He had not been waiting for someone to awaken him with power or command. He had been waiting for someone who would sit beside him, someone who would listen, someone who would not need a throne to know they belonged. Elenara reached slowly into her pouch and drew out the scale. It shimmered brighter now, as if it recognized its home. Without hesitation, she placed it on the stone between them. For a moment, all was still. Then the dragon exhaled, a breath so soft it stirred not air, but memory. The flowers bent gently. The sky shifted to rose, and then, from deep within her, Elenara began to hum. It was not a song she had learned, but one she had always known. It rose from her chest like a story passed down through blood and dream. It was the tune Martha had hummed while steeping tea. The rhythm of the creek behind their cottage, the sound of her heartbeat in moments of wonder. It was the song of belonging. The dragon closed his eye again, but not in sleep, in peace, as if, finally, the weight of centuries could rest. Elenara kept humming, eyes closed, tears on her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from a joy too vast to hold. And when the song ended, she leaned forward, placed her hand gently upon the dragon's paw, and whispered, "I'm here." No light burst, no sky tore open, only the feeling of everything falling into place. She remained there for a long time. The warmth of the dragon's breath steady beside her when she finally rose to leave. She did not feel like a queen. She felt like herself, and that, she now understood, was more than enough. The walk back felt like a dream inside a dream. Elenara left the floating valley with no sound to mark her departure. No closing gate, no final words, not even a farewell glance from the dragon. Only the soft press of grass beneath her steps and the warmth that lingered in her chest like the echo of a song. The sky above her remained that soft, lavender blue, and the mist followed her gently down the slope, parting like old curtains to reveal the forest paths she had taken once before. Only now it felt like an entirely different place. The trees, tall and watchful, greeted her not as strangers, but as familiar guardians. They did not speak, but they didn't need to. Their branches swayed in recognition, and the moss beneath her feet pulsed faintly, as if remembering her tread. Everything felt slower, not in time, but in rhythm. The world no longer hurried her. It moved beside her, like a friend who walks at your pace, not to guide you, but to be with you. She passed the willow tree and paused. The third route, the one that had hidden the dreamer's circle, still curled in the earth like a crescent moon. Elenara knelt by it once more, running her fingers over the moss. The stones still hummed beneath the soil, but they were quieter now, content. There was nothing left to prove, only to remember. As she reached the edge of the village, the sky was painted in hues of peach and soft gold. Smoke curled once more from the chimneys. The scent of baking bread drifted across the breeze. A cat napped on a window ledge, tail twitching in lazy contentment. It was as though nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Children played near the well, their laughter dancing between houses. Martha stood outside the cottage, gently shaking out a rug, her scarf tied loosely around her silver hair. She turned just as Elenara stepped onto the cobblestone path. Their eyes met. No words passed between them, but Elenara smiled, and Marfa's eyes shimmered with quiet joy, the kind that says, "I knew you'd find it." That evening, they sat together in the kitchen, sipping tea brewed with star flower and clove. The golden scale now rested on the shelf above the hearth, tucked into a small wooden frame carved with gentle swirls. It didn't glow anymore. It didn't need to. Elenara looked at it often, not as a relic, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, not of what she had done, but of what she had become. That night, she wandered out to the garden after Marfa had gone to bed. The stars blinked overhead, quiet and infinite. The wind hummed low through the lavender. Kay, in the creek behind the house, whispered its never-ending song. She lay in the grass, Kay, hands folded behind her head, and looked at the sky like she always had, but this time not in longing, in thanks. The dreams still came, but they were different now. Not messages, not mysteries, just visits. Sometimes she found herself back at the floating valley, sitting beside the dragon, who never spoke. Sometimes she dreamt of walking through clouds with no ground beneath her feet, guided only by soft laughter in the distance. And sometimes, sweetest of all, she saw herself much older, reading stories to a circle of wide-eyed children, her voice gentle, her eyes bright. She didn't need to travel far anymore to feel wonder. Now, it bloomed in the simplest of things, in the sound of a bird's wings cutting through morning air, in the way her shadow stretched long and quiet at dusk, in the warmth of Marfa's hug, in her own breath, slow, steady, certain. She was still Elenara, still the girl who loved willow trees and silent books and soft rains. But now she carried something invisible within her, something rooted and vast, the knowing, the remembering, and through her. The dragon slept no longer, not because he had risen to rule, but because he no longer needed to. He was awake, and that was enough. There comes a moment, near the end of every day, when the world seems to exhale. The sun sinks low, and everything slows. Even the wind grows quiet, brushing softly against windows like a hand closing a book. Lamps are lit, not just for light, but for comfort. Doors are closed with care, and in that golden hush, something tender settles in. Elenara stood at the edge of the hill behind her home, where the grass grew tall and the trees gave way to open sky. From here, she could see the rooftops of Roseville, the smoke curling upward, the gentle flicker of hearts behind warm glass. The village pulsed with its usual rhythm, bread baking, dogs barking, shutters creaking, but from this hill, it all sounded like a lullaby. She held a small, leather-bound journal in her hands, one Marfa had given her just that morning, wrapped in a ribbon the color of wild violets. On the first page, in Marfa's neat script, were the words, "For the one who listens. May your stories be soft and your voice steady. The world needs more of both." Elenara sat down in the tall grass, legs folded beneath her, and opened the book. She didn't rush. She let the breeze turn the first page for her, and then, with the last light of the sun bathing the hill in amber, she began to write. She didn't start with the dragon. She didn't even start with herself. She began with the wind, that the wind remembers everything. It carries the laughter of the trees, the sighs of sleeping creatures, and the hum of stories that no longer have voices to tell them. It brought me to a place between dreaming and waking, a place where I was both small and endless, a place where I was called queen, not because I ruled, but because I remembered how to kneel beside a sleeping heart. Her handwriting was careful but unhurried, her fingers moving with the certainty of someone who no longer doubted what she carried inside when she finished the first page. She closed the journal and held it to her chest. The sky had deepened to a soft indigo, the first stars peeking through like shy eyes. The world below shimmered with candlelight and quiet. And overhead, the moon rose, not full, not new, just perfectly in between, like a promise half whispered. A soft meow pulled her attention at her side. A small cat with silver-tipped ears and eyes like fog had appeared, curling its tail around her legs. She smiled and reached down, letting it press its head into her palm. "You again," she whispered. The cat purred once, then settled beside her, as though it, too, had come just to witness this ending. The golden scale now rested on a little wooden stand by the hearth. She hadn't touched it in days. She didn't need to. Its light had dimmed to something gentle, not gone, just at peace, like the dragon himself, still present, still watching, but no longer waiting. Back in her attic room, the painting on the ceiling remained. The sleeping dragon, wings curled, breath slow. But Elenara no longer stared at it with questions. Now, she whispered to it with gratitude. "Rest well, old friend." And the stars above her blinked in time. Martha's voice called gently from downstairs. It was time for tea. Time for the final story of the day, spoken in the hush of lamplight and love. Elenara stood, brushing grass from her skirt, and looked around one last time. She saw no thrones, no crowns, no torches lit in triumph. Only the soft light of home, only the quiet strength of longing, only the last breath of day turning into night. She turned and walked back down the hill. The fire crackled, the tea steamed, and somewhere, in a place between this world and the next, a dragon watched the stars and smiled. Another dream recorded, another soul gently guided. This story brought you peace. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a whisper in the comments. Until the next moonrise. Sleep well, dreamer.